Here we have the picture we started with, the peripheral nervous system. Right, remember, if the nerve comes out of the spinal cord, then we're going to call it a spinal nerve. And if it comes out of the brain, then we're going to call it a cranial nerve. And we're going to look at cranial nerves right now. We have 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and they're associated with the brain. You're going to see some come from the forebrain and some rest within the brain stem. Most are mixed nerves, meaning they have both sensory information going in and they carry motor information going out. So remember, out is motor and in is sensory. But there are two pairs that are purely sensory. We're going to look at the cranial nerves, and they use Roman numerals. So if you don't know your Roman numerals, you have to go back and learn them. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4. If you write 1, 2, 3, 4 on the test, you get deduction. So do not do this. You need to know the cranial nerves, because they might say in notes, lesion, cranial nerve, 9. So this is how you would chart it. You wouldn't say cranial nerve 9. Not right. So you need to know the Roman numerals. Here's the location of all the cranial nerves as they exit the brain, hence the term cranial nerve, right? It comes out of the brain, either the brain stem or the actual forebrain or front part of the brain. So you do not have to ID. So no ID on brain. We're going to walk through each one of these nerves and we're going to find out what it does. You do need to know the function, but you will not have to ID it on a brain model. There's a table here in your book. It lists the cranial nerves. It gives you all of the names and the numbers. It tells you their sensory function and whether they have a motor function. I'm going to make this really easy. Like this one says some. So what I want you guys to do is these two, 1 and 2, are sensory only. Everybody else, we're going to say mixed for this class. Another class, they might ask you to be more specific. But to me, if you have some, that means, yes, you have motor function, right? I didn't ask you too much, too little, right? I just said, do you have motor function? So you're going to tell me number 1 and 2 cranial nerves are sensory only. Everybody else is mixed, meaning it has both sensory and motor function. Number 1, cranial nerve, olfactory nerve. Arises from olfactory receptor cells in the nasal cavity, and this is purely sensory. So basically what we're saying is there is no motor message sent to this nerve. So here we can see our olfactory bulb, our olfactory tract here, and you can see the olfactory nerve, or nerves plural, extending into the nasal cavity. So purely sensory. And what's their function? They carry smell, right, or odor messages to the brain. Cranial nerve number 2, optic nerve, arises from the retinas, passes through the optical canal. This is purely sensory. So this means there's no motor function from brain sent to optic nerve. B. So all your optic nerve is doing is taking sensory information to your brain. That's all it's doing. Here you can see the optic nerve. The optic nerve has this crossover section, and then eventually all of our optic information goes to the visual cortex that's back here in the occipital lobe. So purely sensory, carries impulses for vision. So it takes the sensory information of vision and sends it to the brain for interpretation. All right, number 3 here, ocular motor. Tells you right away what it's going to do, right? eye and move them. So this is going to extend from the midbrain. So this ocular motor is going to exit the brain, midbrain here, through the orbital fissure, the bone behind the eye, right? And go to the extrinsic eye muscles and cause these muscles to contract. And when the muscles contract, what can we do? We can raise an eyelid, move an eyeball, control lens shape. And this, I have it highlighted because ocular motor is a little different, that it also constricts the iris. We're going to talk about parasympathetic in chapter 14, so this will come back up in 14. But if you see anything that says, which cranial nerve does eye movement and controls iris and the amount of light. We haven't talked about the iris, so it's hard for me to explain, but the amount of light entering. When you do the lab workbook pages, you'll have some scenarios, like what muscle or what cranial nerve is involved with rolling your eyes. Well, this is one of them. What nerve or what cranial nerve are you using when you're reading? Well, this is one of them. Not only the ocular motor, but also constricting the iris and controlling the lens shape. The other two are movement only. I'll show you those in a minute. So coming out of the midbrain, remember that's the midbrain. Coming out of the midbrain, we have the ocular motor nerve. It goes through the fissure in the bone, and then it innervates the upper eye muscle, so the superior eye muscle, the lateral eye muscle, the inferior eye muscle, and the nerve goes all the way out to control the iris. Here's our second trochlear nerve. This is number 4. So trochlear nerve. These are going to also come from the midbrain, and they're going to innervate the superior oblique muscles. And this is the primary motor nerve that directs the eyeball. So this is coming out of our midbrain, going to this superior eye muscle, causing eye movement. We're on number 5, trigeminal nerve. This is the largest cranial nerve, and it has 3 different divisions. And we'll see that it's associated with areas of the face and mastication or chewing. This means chewing. So here's number 5, trigeminal nerve. We said that it exits here, right? Pons, midbrain area. And it's going to go out, and it's going to innervate the face, the forehead, the nose. Then it's going to come down to the maxilla, and then it's going to come down to the mandible. So when you see this trigeminal nerve, you should be thinking about chewing. It also has a little bit of facial, right? It's going to innervate part of the face, the cheek, upper cheeks, underneath the eyes, the nose, and the forehead. Number 6 is called abducens nerve. This is another eye nerve, right? Controlling eye movement. So this is coming from the pons, and we're going to see this is primarily a motor, and this one is innervating the lateral rectus muscle. So you can see it coming out of the pons and going to the lateral muscle of the eye. So this is also going to be involved in eye movement. So make sure you go back and look at the 3 cranial nerves involved in, I can't seem to write today, nerves involved in eye movement. Next is facial. This is number 7. And this is the chief motor nerve of the face. So if we want to send a message from the brain to the face, this is one of the nerves we could send the message on. This gives us the ability to have facial expression, also taste, and moving parts of the tongue and sensory from the tongue. So let's look at the image. So here is the facial nerve. And you can see that if you place your hand over the face, you can see the different sections or subsections of the facial nerve. So you can see it extends from the brainstem. Part of it goes up to the eye, controls the lacrimal gland. Some of it goes to the nasal cavity, roof of the mouth, the tongue, your salivary glands, right? So also controlling muscles of the face. And that's what they're trying to show you here. Here's number 8. This is the vestibular cochlear. So we haven't gotten to this part yet, but this is hearing, Cochlea is for hearing. Vestibule is for equilibrium. So we have it here. Hearing and equilibrium receptors. Mostly sensory, a little bit of motor. So because it's both, we're going to call it a mixed cranial nerve. This structure here is my cochlea, and you can see there's a cochlear nerve. This part is my vestibule, and all of this, and you can see the vestibule, and you see how the vestibular nerve and the cochlear nerve merge together, and they enter the brainstem. So what we're saying is we have sensory information from both of these organs going into and delivering information to the brain. But that's the sensory part. We did say that there are some motor functions, right? So small motor component can adjust the sensitivity of the sensory receptors. So adjust how much or how loud the sound is. So small motor, still mixed. Here's cranial nerve number 9. This is your glossopharyngeal or pharyngeal. So it's going to have something to do with your pharynx and something to do with your tongue. And to me, this is going to say something about swallowing, because you have to take the food from your tongue and push it into your pharynx, and then hopefully it goes to your esophagus, right? And then eventually to your stomach. So we can see the glossopharyngeal number 9. We can see the brainstem here. We said sensory has something to do with tongue and chemoreceptors and taste, right? So we can see here chemicals on the tongue could excite and send a message to the brain. Also, there are some motor nerves. So this is carrying motor fibers to the pharyngeal muscles or the pharynx for swallowing. So we can see here it's sending nerve impulses to the pharynx to allow us to contract and swallow. Now we have the vagus nerve. This is the only cranial nerve, this is number 10, the only cranial nerve that extends beyond the head and neck region. Most are motor fibers, and they're going to regulate activities of the heart, the lungs, and the abdominal viscera. There are some sensory fibers that are going to carry impulses from to the brain from the chest and the abdominal section. So here's the image. We can see out of the medulla, we have all of these organs that are being innervated by the vagus nerve. Now we have number 11, the accessory nerves. These innervate the trapezius and the sternocleido or cleidomastoideus muscle. Here we have 11, the accessory nerves. These are a little strange. You can read through here that the rootlets arise from the spinal cord, they pass upward into the skull, and then they come back out with the vagus nerve and supply these muscles. So the sternocleidomastoideus and the trapezius. But there's some debate, because they actually come out of the spinal cord, why are they not called spinal nerves? Is it because they make a loop back to the brain and then come back out? You know, because they don't arise from the brain. So who knows, maybe we'll be kicking the accessory nerves out. But right now they're still included. So usually it's hard for people to think, well, why are they innervating these muscles? So far, everything we've done has kind of been primitive, right? You're looking at stuff, you're hearing stuff, you're responding to those sensory messages, right? But one of the things we don't think about is if you hear a loud sound, you automatically turn to the direction of the sound. And to do that, you would need to contract these muscles in order to turn your head, to whip your head around, right? So a lot of cranial nerves, you'll hear people talk about the fact that these are kind of primitive behaviors. And I kind of see that. I understand. I could fit all of these in there, right? Eye movement, hearing, taste, swallowing. Last one we have is number 12. This is your hypoglossal. So again, glossal is going to mean tongue. Hypo is going to mean below. So exits the medulla, right? And it's going to innervate the intrinsic and extrinsic muscles of the tongue that contribute to swallowing and speech. So you can see the cranial nerve here going to the tongue and going to the muscles below the tongue. That's why it's called hypoglossal. So you should be able to go through this cranial chart and kind of tell me what's going on. Remember, these two are sensory only. Everybody else is mixed, meaning it has both sensory and, plus some sort of motor function. Some of these are repeats. Some of them do kind of the same task, right, or function. So remember, ocular motor, this is eye movement, but you also added the iris and the lens control. So something about vision, right, or amount of light for vision. Now remember, trochlear, this was also eye movement. Abducens, this was eye movement, but we said specific, right? One's superior, one's lateral. Remember trigeminal. Trigeminal, you should automatically think chewing. Mandible, maxilla. Facial, this is motor to the face, or facial muscles. Vestibular, cochlear, hearing and balance. Glossopharyngeal, it's involved with taste, but it's also involved in swallowing, where the hypoglossal is swallowing only. There's nothing about taste. This is mostly motor. So go through the chart and make little flashcards, if you will, or do the lab worksheets, and just make sure you understand the ones that are similar, like ocular motor, trochlear, and abducens, but also make sure you realize how they're different. There are mnemonics, so clean versions and dirty versions, take your pick, but they're in the order that we looked at them. So this is number 1, olfactory. This is 2, optic. This is 3, ocular motor. Then we have 4, trochlear, 5, trigeminal, right? Abducens, which is 6, facial, which is 7. So you get the idea. If in the future anybody wants to know which ones are sensory motor and if they're both. So we've been saying mixed, but you can also say both. So they'll say this is number 1, olfactory. This is number 2. This is number 3, ocular motor. So it's mostly motor. This is number 4, right? It's mostly motor. This is number 5. It does both. This is number 6. It's mostly motor. So you'd have to go back and correspond. What's cranial nerve number 1, 2, 3, you know. And so basically you have a word and the first letter is telling you whether it's sensory motor or both. So future only. So for this class, 1, 2, sensory only. Rest are both sensory and motor.